90.3 WHPC now presents Law You Should Know. The law affects every aspect of our lives, our home, our jobs, and our recreational activities. Now, learn about the law and how to protect yourself against the loss of your liberty or property, and learn how to stand up for your rights and seek compensation when you have been wronged. Your host for Law You Should Know is attorney Kenneth J. Landau, a past dean of the Nassau Academy of Law, and frequently lectures to lawyers on ethics and avoiding problems with clients, and to the public on how to choose and use lawyers. This is Law You Should Know on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hi, this is Law You Should Know, and this is your host, Ken Landau, and my topic tonight is how to start and grow a nonprofit. And my expert, who's going to educate all of us about it, is Alan Bromberger, and he has a firm specializing in nonprofit law, including social impact, impact investing, and philanthropy. And he has written a book, The Art of Social Enterprise. Alan, welcome to Law You Should Know.
Thank you, Ken.
For someone out there who wants to help build, or maybe they want to start a nonprofit, they want to do some good here or somewhere abroad, how can they get their project off the ground?
So I think what people should understand is that when you're starting a nonprofit, there are various kind of procedures that you have to follow, and there are various kinds of rules and regulations that you have to follow. The actual formation of a nonprofit is pretty straightforward. There are basically 3 steps to it. So step number 1 is you form the nonprofit in New York or in Delaware or in California or whatever state you're located in. That's the first step. You file a piece of paper and you form this nonprofit corporation, which is what the charity is going to be. And then you have to do some internal housekeeping. You have to prepare bylaws and adopt bylaws. You have to appoint directors and officers and authorize the opening of bank accounts and all the things that you then have to do to make this what is essentially a piece of paper that's filed, to turn that into an actual functioning organization. And then the final step typically is to apply to the IRS for tax-exempt status.
And that's important because this way someone who donates to you will be making a charitable donation.
That's correct. So the tax code, the U.S. tax code, says that most entities have to pay taxes. You're a business, you're an individual, whatever, you pay taxes. But there's an exception for certain types of organizations, and these are all listed in Section 501 of the tax code. And Section 501 has 29 different subsections that describe everything from charities to social clubs to Indian tribes, labor unions, and so forth and so on. Only one of those subcategories, which is known as 501c3, which describes charitable and educational organizations, accepts tax-deductible contributions. All of the 29 subsections have one thing in common, which is that they don't pay federal tax on their income. But 501c3 has this additional tax benefit that the donors, people who give money to the charity, get a tax write-off for the amount of their contribution.
And what are some examples of some groups that might qualify for 501c3 status?
So the 2 broadest categories are charitable and educational, and both of those terms are interpreted very, very broadly. So charitable includes things like preserving the environment or combating neighborhood deterioration or serving an underserved community. Educational includes any kind of teaching of skills that help the person improve their life. Certainly it includes formal educational programs of various sorts, but generally where people are developing new skills or gaining new knowledge. And then, of course, there are a lot of things that charities do that are sort of both charitable and educational, meaning it's teaching the public about, you're raising awareness about an issue, providing information to the public about that issue, and that piece is educational, but you may also have a program to try to protect the environment or support education in the U.S. or overseas or something else, which is also considered charitable.
And when charities are being rated or evaluated by various organizations or watchdogs, they will be rated on how much of the funds they collect go to both of those purposes.
Yeah, they do. This is a thing that's become a little bit controversial because it used to be in the old days you'd use an overhead ratio. So somebody said, well, 10% of our money goes to overhead, the rest goes to programs. But of course, in the actual doing of it, those distinctions are not so nice and neat. I mean, you have people working on a program. Is it administration? Is it program? What is it? And so there is now a lot of talk about trying to move away from that particular metric to talk about whether the charity is actually being effective, whether it's having an impact, whether it's doing anything. But it's very, very difficult to collect that information. Most charities don't really have the ability to do that. If literacy is going up or down, is it because what the charity did, or is it just something that's happening? Crime is going up or down. How do you prove that's because of what the charity did? So still, I think this idea of looking at these overhead ratios is there, and it's something that people should be cognizant of, and some of the rating agencies do use it as a basis for their ratings, but I think the more important thing is not to dwell on those artificial distinctions, but instead focus on whether you're doing stuff that makes a difference, that's going to have a positive impact on society.
If you're demonstrating that on PR or flyers or social media, it's going to help increase the number and amount of donations.
Absolutely, because people survey donors all the time to find out what do they care about and what are they giving to and how much are they giving. And the two questions that donors sort of always ask is, what's the impact? What am I getting for my money, so to speak? Even though it's not a personal benefit, it's some benefit to society that they're trying to finance. And the other thing is, how much is everybody else giving? And those tend to be the most important questions that donors want to ask. The impact being probably by far the largest. And certainly if you're doing direct mail, these days that's all email, or you're going on social media, or you're doing web-based fundraising where you may be reaching large numbers of people who don't know each other and have nothing necessarily in common. The ability to tell the story about what you're doing and the impact that you're having becomes extremely important.
And hopefully credibly. And if you do need the 501c to be a 501c3 to seek contributions, or it's only so that the donor is going to get the tax deduction for it?
So it's a little of both, which is to say a tax-deductible contribution is just a gift that's made to a 501c3 organization. So you can make gifts to anybody you want, including to a nonprofit which is not a 501c3. It won't be tax-deductible, but you can do it. One of the issues is that, particularly in states like New York that have active regulators, if you're raising money from people and it's not tax-deductible, you're supposed to tell them that. Otherwise, the Attorney General takes the position that you may be misleading people to give you, thinking they're getting a tax deduction when they're not. So it's not illegal, but there are definitely some do's and don'ts.
And, aside from the legal issues, and I'm sure we'll discuss a few, it's important to keep careful records about how much you're taking in and how much is being spent, let's say, on overhead or on administration, and how much is going to the population you're trying to help or on getting information to them.
That's absolutely true. And in fact, every charity has to file an annual report with IRS where they talk about where the money has come from and how it's been used and what kind of impact has been had, and all sorts of technical reporting. So you have to have systems in place so that you can provide those reports to IRS. And if certainly in New York, but in most states, there's also a report filed with the state attorney general, which covers sometimes the same territory as the IRS. Some states will just sort of allow you to file your IRS report as the state report, maybe with a separate cover page. But yes, you are, and those reports are publicly available, and anybody can look at them, and anybody can follow up and ask questions. So it's really important to make sure that the information that's in there is accurate and complete to the best that you can do it.
I just want to remind our listeners, you're listening to 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College in Garden City, New York, and you're listening to attorney Alan Bromberger, who's talking about starting and building a nonprofit. And this program is also being presented as a podcast. If you've missed any part of it or you want to tell someone else about it, you can just go to the website at nccradio.org and listen to this and many other helpful podcasts about the law. Alan, in order to, let's say, apply for grants, is that 501c3 status important?
Yes. So typically when you're applying for grants, there are sort of two kinds of grants. One kind are government grants, where you're applying to the government for funds to provide services in a neighborhood or whatever it might be. And the government does not generally require 501c3 status because they don't have to deduct their contributions. They're a government. They don't pay tax. But grants from private foundations and other institutions generally do require that you be 501c3. So if it's a private foundation, the Ford Foundation or the Gates Foundation or whatever foundation it may be, they generally require that as part of the application process, you got to provide the letter from IRS that says you're a 501c3. Otherwise, generally, they're not going to give. There are exceptions. And lots of donors, particularly if you're talking about sizable gifts, they have accountants and lawyers who are looking out for their stuff as well, and they often typically require the IRS 501c3 letter as a condition of getting funding. But there are exceptions.
And what are some other ways to solicit or sources of funding for your nonprofit?
Well, so, the most obvious one and the one that people think about are gifts, grants, and contributions, where donors are giving money to the nonprofit to support its work. But we also are seeing these days a lot of nonprofits that are engaging in commercial activities. Maybe they develop some software to use in a medical facility, and now they want to market that. Or I've had clients, I had a battered women's shelter, and they opened up a line of cosmetics and soaps to sell to raise money to support the battered women's shelter. And so that is now opening up to be a fruitful area for organizations, is not just depending on gifts, but maybe they have services that they can charge for. Depends on who you're serving, depends on how you're operating, but that's become quite viable for a lot of organizations.
And if you're offering if you're offering services or providing a product, at some point is it a good idea to take out liability insurance in case something goes wrong?
Yes, even if you're not providing goods or services to the public and charging for it, you absolutely need to have good insurance. Nonprofit organizations are responsible for what they do and liable just like anyone else. There's no exception for charities that says, oh, you're not liable if somebody gets hurt. So you have, if you have an office, you have to worry about that. But if you're running a summer camp, you need lots of insurance. If you're working with disadvantaged populations very often, or in activities where somebody could be injured or anything like that, you would always be advised to have insurance. And again, this is something that for smaller groups can be difficult. They may not have room in the budget to get insurance. But I always advise my clients, basic insurance is not that expensive. And I always advise my clients that they need to have the right kind of insurance if they're going to go forward. To me, it's one of the things that helps you understand whether you're really ready and able to go forward with a nonprofit or not.
If you're doing work for a bigger nonprofit or for a profitable organization or governmental agency, could you ask to be covered as an insured on their policy?
Yes, that's very common. And the opposite is true as well. You may find if you take out a lease that the landlord wants to be named on the charity's insurance policy. That kind of thing of being named as an additional insured and piggybacking on somebody else's coverage is common, and generally speaking works fine, but it does require making some arrangements. The other side has to agree to that, and it could affect premiums. It could affect their eligibility for the coverage. So it's not always an automatic thing.
And another aspect of the 501c3 is how much does it cost to start, and how long does it take to get the organization going?
So, like with a lot of things, the answer depends a little bit on what you're doing. If it's a relatively simple organization that's not dealing with a lot of complexity or a lot of money, and it's a group of people who just want to do something, it's a relatively simple and straightforward process, and it can be done for a couple $1,000s. And that's usually just for the setting up of the nonprofit, the bylaws, the initial resolutions to make it operational, and then the application for tax-exempt status. But if you're raising money in different states, you may have to register in those states. If you have a trademark you want to protect, that's not going to be included. If you want sales tax exemption or property tax exemption if you own a piece of property, those things are not typically included. So you have to think a little bit about what you want. But I would say for the average nonprofit, where they have some money they're going forward, but not a lot, and they're getting started and they're cost conscious, but they want the sort of whole package of startup stuff, you're probably going to expect to pay about $10,000 if you're hiring a lawyer at market rates. And
what would the basis for a nonprofit status for property? How would that work? What would the requirements of the government be to allow that?
Property taxes are done in New York State, and in a lot of states are done by cities and by counties, not by the state government. So each city or county has its own rules. Generally speaking, what they require is that the property has to be owned by a charity, and it has to be used for charitable purposes. So if you're an educational group and you have a building and you're providing classes there and you have your administrative offices there and so forth and so on, those are going to be considered exempt uses and you're going to be eligible for tax exemption. But if you're using it for housing for unrelated people, we have this with hospitals that create housing for their staff, those very often are not exempt from property tax. Or you're running a business out of a location, you happen to be a charity, but you're running a business, that's probably not going to be exempt. If you are renting the property and you don't own it, even if you're renting the entire property, you're not going to be exempt because you don't own it. And, New York City has a pretty complicated process with a lot of bureaucracy involved. You deal with the Department of Taxation and Finance. But some counties upstate, for example, and in other states, it's a relatively straightforward process. In some places, like California and some parts of upstate and some places where the government is really hurting for money and they really don't want to give tax exemptions if they don't have to, because the property tax goes directly to the local government, they make it very, very difficult. Some places they won't give a property tax exemption unless they absolutely, if it's a hospital or it's a library or something where they have to give tax exemption, they will, but otherwise they won't.
And is it governed more by the local laws or by state laws?
It's governed mostly by local law. Every state has a law that authorizes municipal government to decide who to tax and who not to tax. So there is a state law involved, but those decisions are typically made at the local level. So in New York State, for example, there are two types of property tax exemption. One type, which applies to hospitals, universities, certain types of organizations, is mandatory, meaning the local government cannot impose a property tax on those types of organizations. But all the other types of nonprofits, environmental groups, educational groups, scholarship groups, whatever it may be, they don't have an automatic property tax exemption. And if they own property, they have to apply for it. Churches are in a separate category because I know religious organizations, which are part of the nonprofit sector, are a little bit different in some respects. But with respect to owning property and paying taxes, they're no different than anybody else.
And what are the surprises? What else would surprise our listeners about running a nonprofit?
So I think the thing that surprises most people is how much work is involved. I mean, even though I can make it sound simple, and in some ways it is straightforward, the doing of it, as you say, you have to keep books and records. Your employment practices have to be right. If you're dealing with vendors, you have to have contracts. You have to do your annual reporting. You have to do your banking. You have to be paying attention to your programs, and are you hiring the right people, and are they being run? The board of directors has to meet. The board of directors has to get regular information and participate in decisions. And it's just a lot of work to do it correctly. Again, large, sophisticated organizations have a lot more of that to deal with than smaller community-based organizations that might be run a little bit informally. But at the end of the day, everybody's got to comply. Everybody's got to do certain basic things correctly or they're going to get in trouble.
And you also, whether you're large or small, you want to make sure you have a continuing source of funds.
That's correct. I mean, obviously, if there's a scandal or a newspaper story and somebody says, well, they weren't really doing things correctly, or the board wasn't paying attention, or the programs are in trouble and nobody did anything about it, the first thing that happens is your donations dry up immediately. And sometimes I tell my clients, don't worry about the attorney general, worry about the newspapers, because a scandal can put a charity out of business much faster than any legal process.
And on the flip side, good PR can help to increase donations.
That's absolutely true. It absolutely can. And in these days of social media and so many different ways to communicate, the ability to sort of develop messaging around what you do and what impact you have and what you need money for, and those kinds of things become incredibly important, because it becomes fairly easy for somebody to just Google the name of your charity and see what's out there. And if what they're getting are great stories about what a terrific program you have, or you won an award, or you got a new grant, that's going to encourage people to give, because it's going to create positive momentum. If they Google you and they find out, oh, the board all resigned, or you were sued by somebody, or there was an accusation of wrongdoing, they're probably not going to write a check.
So a good way of summing up is what Google would say about you, what a search would say about you.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, what we discovered and what we now make everybody aware of is that when you send in your application to IRS, the first thing that the examiner does is Google you and see what comes up. And they look at your website and they see what's there. So if the story you're going to tell IRS is different from what the story that's on your website, you better change your website.
And that's probably true for donors too.
It's absolutely true for donors. I mean, the whole notion of transparency in the nonprofit sector has completely changed, because people can get information about you for better or worse, true or not. But that aspect of running a charity, I think, has changed quite a bit.
And you mentioned about trademark. If someone wants to register their name, or you mentioned their logo, or perhaps their slogan, do many charities do that? Yeah, a lot of charities do. It takes some time and it costs some money, so not everybody does. And sometimes people don't do it at the beginning, but they do it later when they start to have some success, or they're worried about somebody using their name without permission or whatever it might be, especially if you have a really great name. And it's quite easy that somebody else could come up with that name and decide to start using it. You're much better off if you protect it. A trademark is the easiest way to do that. And trademark law is sort of its own little separate area of law. But basically what you're doing is you're going to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office and saying, we're using this name in commerce, and using it for philanthropy and nonprofits and fundraising is considered commerce for this purpose.
And there's actually a category of trademarks for fundraising services and social services and educational services. So depending upon what you're doing, you can protect your mark generally, but also for very specific uses.
And your mark may live on beyond the life of the charity.
It might. The trademark actually becomes an asset of the charity. It's part of what the charity owns. And so, one of the issues, if we ever decide to dissolve a charity or something happens and you kind of reach end of life, or in a merger or in some kind of partnership or joint venture where the charity is going to join with somebody else and become part of something that's larger, those trademarks, those names, because the reputation comes with them, are often important to discuss and make sure you know what you're going to do with them.
And I just want to remind our listeners, you're listening to Alan Bromberger, and he's an expert at forming and helping charities and helping them to grow. And you're also listening to 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College. Alan, just give us your final thoughts on, and do you encourage everyone with a charitable idea or dream or desire to pursue that path?
Well, I encourage people to pursue their goals and ambitions. I think the real question is whether you need to set up your own nonprofit to do that. And if you do, whether you need to go through the whole process at IRS to do that. So very often, if people aren't really prepared to do the work, or they're thinking about something that may be relatively short term, like responding to a natural disaster or creating a scholarship for somebody in memory of somebody, may not be something that you're going to be doing for 5 or 10 years, even though the enthusiasm is high when you begin, that you're probably better off affiliating with an existing nonprofit and sort of being hosted or incubated there to see how it goes. There's also something called fiscal sponsorship, where you can hook up with another organization and essentially use their tax exemption to raise money for your program. And that's done through a contractual arrangement, very common and often used.
And it might be done under the name of your cause.
Absolutely. You keep your own name. You can even form your own corporation. You're just skipping the IRS part. And then that fiscal sponsor is doing the reporting to IRS and sending the thank you letters to donors and responsible for all that compliance, which they normally charge for. But again, depending upon the organization you're creating, it may be a lot cheaper to do that than to try to hire your own people to do it all on your own.
Okay. I'd like to thank our special guest today, Alan Bromberger, who's an attorney specializing in nonprofits. If you missed any part of the program, feel free to listen to our podcast at nccradio.org. You're listening to Law You Should Know here on 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College. And please join us next week at this same time for another program on Law You Should Know.